Hello and good morning. My name is Francyne Harrigan. I'm with the United Nations Department of Public Information. We're very pleased to have you join us today for the launch of UNCTAD's Economic Development in Africa Report 2017, which focuses on tourism for transformative and inclusive growth. Today, to tell us about the report's findings, I'm very pleased to welcome Ms. Chantal Carpentier, Chief of the New York office for UNCTAD. Chantal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francyne. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to introduce this report that will be introduced around the world by different colleagues of UNCTAD. The document is available in French and Spanish and other UN languages after the embargo is lifted this afternoon. And so you can find it online. And this is one of the 8 flagship reports that UNCTAD prepares every year. So you're welcome to go to the website and get the other report, which are the World Investment Report, the Trade and Development Report. So everything that has to do pretty much with the macroeconomic situation worldwide. But today we focus on the Africa Development in Africa report. We decided to focus on tourism and its role in terms of transformative and inclusive growth in Africa for several reasons that we'll be covering today. But the overall message is pretty much that tourism is growing in Africa. However, it could create much more impacts in terms of GDP growth for the countries of Africa, especially if we could include the indirect revenues linked to tourism, which are now limited, as well as increasing for the sub-Saharan Africa, the international arrival. The good news is a lot of the tourism is led by Africans themselves right now. So what we're going to go through quickly today for you is the stylized facts, and you have in your packet in the press briefing some of the data that you can also use. So why is tourism so important for Africa? Then the African Union tourism target and outlook and the link to the SDGs, and then some of the policies that we've been identifying that could increase the potential of tourism to create decent job and sustainable growth in Africa. So quickly, what we're going to do is to go to each of these stylized facts today. Tourism is an important contributor to African economy. That's a no-brainer. It's labor-intensive and therefore create a lot of job in a context where there's a lot of unemployment and a lot of young people in Africa in a growing sector. Tourism is a dynamic and fast-growing sector worldwide. Tourism is a major export category, is increasingly driven by Africans themselves, as I said. Intra-regional tourism matter. And tourism foster inclusivity, and tourism contribute to achieving the SDGs. So we'll go through those quickly. In terms of why is it an important contributor to the economy of African countries, the tourism total contribution to the GDP is increasing. It was 6.8% in the 95-98 period. It is now 2001-2014. It represents 8.5% of the GDP. But this is still low compared to average in terms of international contribution of tourism to GDP. The total contribution of tourism to African economy is 166 billion, and the direct contribution, that means hotel and airplanes and food, is 70 billions. Tourism attract capital investment of 26 billion. Again, this could be increased significantly. It represents 1.8% of the GDP. And tourism is a key driver of growth in different countries, but particularly in African small island development states. So there are 3 islands that we'll see here, Capo Verde, Seychelles, and Mauritius, that for which the tourism represents 26%, 43%, and 61% of their GDP. And for the other countries, as you can see, the lighter the color, the less contribution of tourism to their GDP. It's also divided differently across the region. The Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, and Egypt alone account for 64% of the revenues of tourism. And therefore, that means there's a huge potential for increase in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in terms of job creation, we all know that tourism is a labor-intensive and important job creator. In Africa, tourism created about 21 million jobs over the last 10 years. That means 1 out of every 14 jobs that were created. Another 11.7 million is projected to be created from tourism over the next 10 years. And what's interesting about these job creation, it's also because they can be low skills and then bring in people into the sector. But also 47% of hotel and restaurant sector employees in Africa are women. And 36% of tourism ministers are actually women in Africa, which is actually higher than the rest of the world. Now, in terms of the dynamic and of the tourism sector, this is a graph that gives you kind of a summary of international tourist arrival. That's on the right axis, thousands of people arriving. So the top line is international arrival. The gray line is tourist export revenue, with the left axis in terms of the millions of dollars. And then the last one is international tourist revenues. Receipt. So what does that mean concretely in terms of tourism contribution to the export revenues? It's been growing at 9% per year between 1995 and 2014 in Africa. It represents $47 billion per year. And it represents 7% of total export revenue on average, but it's 46% of services export. So that's a huge part of the services export for the region. And as I mentioned earlier, tourism in Africa is increasingly driven by Africans themselves. And that's related to the growing in middle-income class in Africa, which is a great news overall. So these lines are millions of international arrivals. So you can see the dark red line is Africa. The very bottom line are pretty small, but increasing. But the second line is Europe. So you can see that it's African and European are the top two international arrival in Africa. And in terms of international tourist arrival from Africa itself, you can see it's the dark bottom section here in dark red. So it is still smaller than international arrival from the rest of the world, but it is growing quickly. In terms of that means that there could be quite a bit of work that could be done to increase intra-regional tourism that could be supported by the existing regional agencies that already are working in the region. So for instances, and this is where we're going to come back to that at the end, but the reason we're doing two period and we're not doing every country is because we don't have the data. A lot of countries do not gather the annual data, doesn't disaggregated by gender or doesn't disaggregated by all region of the world. So what we did is to look for four regional economic communities in Africa, the Arab Maghreb Union, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the COMESA, Eastern African Community, the EAC, and the Southern African Development Community, the SADC region. And what we did is to look for each one of them and document basically where the tourism were coming from. So for the the AMU, you have the gray line, and you can see that all of them are increasing, and some of the, except for the SADC is kind of constant there. But basically, a lot of the tourism is coming from, these are percentages on the left-hand side, the axis. So it's from 19% for the AMU region all the way to 60-some% for the SADC region, where the tourism is coming from within the region. And you can see that for this means that if within the SADC region, 64% of tourism come from the region, the similar numbers could be achieved by the other region. And so lessons could be learned from the SADC one. In terms of fostering inclusivity, why do we say that tourism could foster inclusivity? Our colleagues at the ILO have documented that in countries where tourism is dominant, the vulnerable employment rate is lower. Globally, 50% of tourism labor force are age 25 or younger, and tourism can thus contribute to the demographic dividend that we always hear about Africa, providing opportunity for youth employment. there will be actually a need for 122 million new jobs in Africa. Therefore, the more we can create those jobs for the youth, the more it's really important. Tourism is also a sector, as I said earlier, where women thrive. More than 30% of tourism businesses are run by women. And as I mentioned earlier, 36% of tourism ministers are women in the region. They also contribute to the SDGs. They contribute to all of these SDGs, but especially to goal 8, 12, and 14. I'm not going to quiz you today about your goals, see how much you know them. But it specifically contributes to goal 8, target 8.9, that requests that by 2030, devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that create jobs and promote local culture. Target 12B, to implement tools to monitor sustainable development impact for sustainable tourism, which create jobs, promote local culture and products. And target 14.7, to increase the economic benefit of SIDS and LDC from sustainable use of marine resources, including through sustainable management of fisheries, aquaculture, and tourism, which a lot of the African regions have comparative advantage in. Now, in terms of the outlook and the potential for the region, the first 10-year implementation plan of the Agenda 2063, the African strategic plan for 2014-23, had called for a doubling of the contribution of tourism to GDP between 2014 and 2063. Of course, tourism is growing fast and the contribution to GDP is growing fast, but it would have to grow even faster to be able to meet that target as been set by the African community. The tourism direct contribution to GDP is forecast to grow from 73 to 121 billion by 2026, and the number of international arrivals to the continent to increase from 57 million to 134 million. But we'll see how there could be policies put in place both at the national but also at the regional level to increase those this outlook for the tourism in the region. So what are these policies? We basically identified 4 sets of policies that could be put in place. Strengthening inter-sectoral linkages to foster, of course, tourism in the region. Tapping the potential of intra-African tourism. We've discussed that. Promoting the capacity of tourism to foster inclusiveness. That's depend on national policies. And using the mutual benefit a relationship between tourism and peace. And that's an interesting piece that we'll discuss as well. So what does that mean? In general, to ensure so far, there's not a lot of effort put to greater capture the tourism expenditure by local economy. That is, there's very little backward and forward linkages to the economy. And we'll see a few examples in the next slide of what does that mean and how could that be done. And then to integrate into regional and global tourism value chain. So what are some of the examples? For instance, instead of sourcing from local farmers in the region, who are some of the poorest and most vulnerable, oftentimes because these farmers cannot meet international sanitary and phytosanitary standard, these food will be imported into the country instead of being procured locally. Ethiopia, for instance, is a good example to follow, where hotel spending on food accrues to the poor. So they did develop these linkages, the rural-urban linkages of agriculture. And so that means that we would need to have in place capacity building for the producers to be able to meet those standards and produce in time for this demand. And this means also maybe different type of institution in the rural areas, such as cooperative of farmers, so that they can actually receive the training in a way that is efficient. There's also another area which is growing in Africa and the rest of the world, which is medical tourism. It has a north-south and a south-south dimension, but our colleagues are warning that there are positive benefit of it because it attracts international tourism. The negative impact, though, could be that it segregates the private health sector and the public health sector, and therefore it could attract some of the good doctors from the public sector that now are better remunerated in the private sector, and therefore lead to a lack of support in the public sector for healthcare. So this is something, again, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It just means the policy need to be in place to prevent such negative externalities to be produced. In terms of the intersectoral linkages and leakages, it is important to grow the local and regional businesses to reduce the leakages. So oftentimes, if the international arrival are mostly from international airline, international travel agencies, international providers, that means the money gets repatriated back home in the country of origin of those businesses as opposed to stay locally. And therefore, it is important to grow the local business to make sure a lot of this, these new investment and these new return do stay in the country and get reinvested in infrastructure, something that we'll see in a few minutes. This is an example of what we talk about in terms of intersectoral linkages to local hotels and restaurants and agriculture. So this is an example from South Africa and Tunisia, who have both been able to do some of this pretty well. So what you can see, the bubbles, the colors of the bubbles are the gray is agriculture, food product is the maroon red color. So for Tunisia, you could say that the domestic component is up to 80% for agriculture and food, as opposed to for South Africa, which is only about 55%. So clearly there's quite a bit of range that could to improve those local procurement, and it's already done by some of the countries. And how do you do that? To basically, you need to have a conducive policy framework to support local sourcing, promoting local value addition, as we just discussed. So local procurement, having procurement rules for schools and hotels, support the development infrastructure because it's difficult without the infrastructure, and encourage joint venture with the local private sector. And then another benefit of the intra-African tourism is basically because, of course, when do we in the north think of going down on vacation? It's when it's cold here. So whenever it's the winter here, we think, oh, should we go to Africa? Should we go to Latin America where it's going to be warm? So this difference in temperature is not much less pronounced within Africa. So this could smooth that seasonality and create jobs throughout the year as opposed to only during the winters of the boreal countries. It also could create stronger linkages and weaker leakages due to stronger demand for local products. So what we identified is national of Africa are more likely to demand and willing to take local products and local culture than international arrival, who might be more fearful for food security or other issue. And also cultural exchanges create a positive impact and lead to peacefulness in the region. So some of the specific policy that we recommend are the free movement of people and also the easing on visa requirement. So if you go to the SADC region and you need a visa for Tanzania, you need a visa for Namibia, you need a visa for each country you're going to go to, it's a lot of logistics and a lot of time requirement. If you can actually get one visa for the whole region, it makes it easier for you to move around, especially if you have the infrastructure that is developed so you can move from one country to the next. It also makes it easier for the national to move from one country to the next and be able to work in different countries as well. We also identify the open sky. So this is the implementation of Yamoussoukro, I hope I say that right, decision. And this is about the open sky policy. And the reason being because a lot of the flight to Africa come from our European providers. And it's really hard, actually, because there's no liberalization of the air to fly within Africa, and it's very expensive. So trade liberalization within Africa in terms of the airlines would help the secure and safe travel within Africa, which right now is difficult. And I think some of us have traveled, have had the unfortunate experience of having to fly back to Europe to go back to another country within Africa. So that would be alleviating some of this. Also, the currency restriction. If you have to use different currency and go to the bank and get different currency, that's all the transaction costs. We did estimate that the restriction on currency basically lowered the growth in international tourism receipt by about 10%. And this is one of the reasons why some of the Caribbean country, for instance, would accept the US dollar, right? So just to make it easier in terms of cost and transaction cost. And then recognize the value of regional market within Africa and plan for it. Most plans do recognize the value of tourism for the country at the national level and within the economic communities, but there's very little done in reality to promote those. I give the example, I was in Namibia during the COP in South Africa, and they were hosting a meeting of all the SADC tourism ministers to see how they could promote together the tourism that would be coming, so they could go along the region and spend more money in the whole region and instead of just going to South Africa. So that's an example. These are the policies. You can look at them there in the report of different economic community and what their policies are in terms of tourism. I'm not going to go into the detail. And then we, of course, need to promote the capacity of tourism to foster inclusiveness. And that has several components to it. One is we need to require promoting decent work and reduce vulnerability, and that's promoting down the supply chain locally, ensuring decent wages, so that to make sure we have the infrastructure so tourism can reach the rural area where a lot of the rich culture is in these countries. Integrate the poor into tourism value chain we just mentioned. But also ensuring one of the things that we see often is that we're going to develop the safety, water, ICT infrastructure for the hotels and for the tourism. But then you have the local community right next to them that have no access to safe water and sanitation. So we need also to ensure that these infrastructure also serve the local population. Also, if we're going to have all these jobs, we have to make sure that the education, the tourism school are upgraded, and the education is actually matched with the requirement of skills to support this tourism that is growing. And of course, encourage female participation to training, improving working condition, encouraging female entrepreneurship. Women do tend to face greater challenges in terms of access to capital, in terms of networking, in terms of receiving extension services and training, because they can't be alone in the field with a man, for instance. So things such as having women extension agent to give the training could be solutions. The idea of the beneficial relationship between tourism and peace is very interesting because, and we give a few examples in the report, but one of them is very interesting, and it's not only for one country, it's for all countries. I'm going to find a stat for you, but when Ebola hit the Western Africa, tourism for the whole region, all the way to South Africa and Tanzania, that was not at all involved in the epidemic, were actually affected in terms of their tourism. When there was social unrest in Tunisia, tourism to Tunisia reduced by 27%, and revenues reduced by 27%. So there's a huge incentive to have peace and security within the region, not only at the country level, but at the regional level. And then for people of the press, there is every time that something negative is published about Africa, and most of the world do not realize that this is 54 countries that covers a huge mass of land, and that we just generally say this is happening in Africa, it has a negative impact on the intention of international tourists to go to the continent. So we have to be careful in how we portray the information and to portray, because perception of safety is very, it's not objective, it's rather subjective. So we have to be careful also how we report these situations. In terms of, in conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lack of data to be able to document and further support the countries and the decision makers at the country and regional level in terms of arrival, in terms of source of the input for the sectors. And there's also disaggregated by gender and age group. That would be making it easier for decision makers to really capitalize on this great prospect for economic development in Africa, tourism for transformative and inclusive growth. So I'll do my little publicity in concluding. So thank you, Francyne.
With that, I'll open the floor to questions. Please.
Thank you. My name is Abadi. I'm from the dossier paper. Apart from Tunisia and South Africa, which African countries practice medical tourism, which is very highly specialized sector of tourism?
I do not have the answer to this. I don't know. I know of these two, and I would have to put the question to my expert and get back to you.
Thank you. Is there any follow-up question to that one? Any more questions from the floor? Please.
Hi, I came in late, so forgive me if the question was answered. I see the countries with the highest average annual rates of growth in tourism during the time period of 1995 to 2014 were Angola, Cape Verde, and Ghana. What specifically did those countries do that seemed to boost their these numbers to such high percentages?
Some of them is related to ecotourism and the link to peace as well. So whenever it's pretty obvious when we look at the statistics, right? The countries that are at peace and have been at peace have seen higher growth. But the growth of ecotourism and experiential tourism, where tourists no longer just want to go to a beach and sit there and for a week and do nothing except drink tequilas and margaritas, but experience the rich culture. I think it's the countries that can actually develop that linkages to to the regions and to the cultures, the rich values, the artifacts and others that actually do benefit. But I can get more detail for you as well.
Thank you. I see no other questions. Chantal, do you have any closing remarks? Otherwise, that brings us to the close.
No, I just want to thank you for coming today. And apologies, I'm not the expert in this field, but I will put the question to my expert and pass the answer to Francyne so you can have them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chantal, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today.